Welcome to the Flip in the Barrel podcast, the podcast where we dive deep into the stories of energy leaders across our industry and find out more about their career and life journeys. Today, without further ado, we've been waiting for a long time to have Castlen Kennedy on the podcast. Castlen was recently just named the Senior Vice President of HR and Corporate Affairs at Apache, where she has been there for 19 years now. And she just assumed this new role in January of 2025. She previously served as the Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Marketing. And then prior to that role, she served as the Vice President of Corporate Communications and Public Affairs. She spent a lot of her time on the senior policy and advisory side of our business, which is going to be really exciting when you kind of hear from her journey and how she started and got her foot in the door in the energy space. She also holds a bachelor's degree in finance and a master's degree in public affairs, and also a master's degree in energy and earth resources from the University of Texas. I bet you've been following the football games for UT. I've been hearing a lot about that going on recently. Great to have you, Castlen. I'm so excited to have our listeners learn more about your journey.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, Castlen, we usually start the podcast with getting to know our guests from the beginning. So, you're the oldest of 4 daughters. You grew up here in Houston, Texas. We'd love to know a little bit more about just your childhood and how that's shaped you into becoming who you are today. And then also kind of how it's helped you even in your career as you've navigated in your own journey and sports, or just bring us a little bit into, what was home life like. You did mention that every Sunday, you had your suppers and that was like a family tradition, etc. So just tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Right. I'm the oldest of 4 girls and grew up here in Houston. I think being the oldest child always comes with some responsibilities. My parents divorced when I was in middle school, and that certainly kind of led to probably some more responsibility living with my mom, with my younger sisters. But a big part of my life and my sister's lives were definitely sports. I think, my dad had played sports, was an athlete and also just an avid fan of sports. And so when he had 4 girls, he was really encouraging us to get into sports. He didn't quite have the son, but we were all fortunately athletic and liked to play. So I played all the things early on, and then as I kind of made my way through school, really started to focus in on volleyball and basketball, and then through high school played volleyball there till the end. I think that absolutely was something that was pretty formative, playing on a team, being in team sports. There was tremendous camaraderie there, both with, older girls, younger girls, learning from coaches. I mean, I had a lot of very influential coaches throughout all of the sports that I played over the years. So I think all of that very much contributed to the way I approach work today. I'm a big believer in being on a good team, liking the people that you're working with, but more importantly, finding ways to win together and working towards high performance together. So definitely, my sisters and I we're still all very close. All but one of them lives here in Houston. There are 11 kids across the 4 of us, and 9 of them are boys. So my dad finally has all those boys, and they're all into sports. So we get all of the cousins together, and that's a rowdy but really fun time.
Wow, that sounds like such a great childhood. But more importantly, even now, when you say, your dad finally has all the sons, because all of y'all, have y'all's children and their boys. I think that's always just such an amazing experience for grandparents. Looking at your journey, your college years, I remember when we spoke, you talked about sports, and then you also were really big into livestock. Which is that's another thing that's like very time consuming, and also really teaches you just time management, but taking care of an animal is like a whole nother level of learning and process. But you were receiving a scholarship from UT at the time for that, and you actually decided to go to Vanderbilt instead. And there was some stuff happened at Vanderbilt where you got sick. You didn't really get an opportunity to meet people like you wanted to. And I feel like without getting sick, a lot of people choose a college and then they realize like maybe they didn't fit right for them, or maybe they weren't able to meet in with the culture. And then they end up changing, and they have this experience where they thought they were going to be at the school forever, and that was where they're going to get the degree, and then things didn't go out their way. That kind of happened for you, but you ended up at UT, and that was a great experience for yourself. But can you tell us a little bit about what you learned through that time, because you had chosen Vanderbilt, you went there, your grandmother had some influence as well, and kind of advice to the listeners that, might have had that experience, or even maybe have kids that are trying to choose a college and, want to sway them in the right direction.
Yeah, well, so one thing I just will clarify, I didn't have livestock. I was actually quite an urban kid. We had a dog, but I didn't have livestock. But I did apply in high school for several scholarships. I paid for college myself, and one of the scholarships that I received was a full scholarship to go to a state school in Texas through the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. And as you know, though, the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo has a tremendous scholarship program. That is really at the core of part of their charitable contribution and how they give back to the greater Houston community. And so I received this scholarship, and it was a tremendous opportunity. And I remember my parents were like, "This is amazing." I'd applied to UT, I got into UT. And but I'd also applied to some other schools, because what I think was driving me at the time was wanting to go off and do something different. I grew up here, went to high school here. There were a lot of kids from my high school going to A&M, going to UT, going to Tech, going to schools in Texas, and I had this urge that this itch that I wanted to go do something different. And I remember my parents, particularly my dad, really cautioning me and saying, like, "Are you really sure you've thought this through? Like, this is a tremendous opportunity. UT is a great school. You're going to be, close to family. You've got a lot of friends there." And I just didn't, I knew everything. I knew what I wanted to do. And so I chose to go to Vanderbilt. As you mentioned, my grandmother was just somebody who, she loved the idea of Vanderbilt. She was like, "Oh my gosh, it's amazing. It's going to be a wonderful school. And you should," she just thought that was so neat. And so there was something also prideful about maybe wanting to go explore that. As you mentioned, the day before I went, I got pretty sick. And I was sick for the better part of the first semester, like didn't get out of bed for about a month. And I was very sick, and ended up finally coming out of that. But there is this period when you go to school where, especially at a new place, everybody is out trying to meet other people. And I just missed all of that. So when I finally came out from my dorm room, people had kind of settled into groups, and it was just hard for me to really find my niche, to really find my group. And I did ultimately find it. I found it kind of over time, and in the spring in particular, I really kind of found my group. But I'd already made up my mind kind of in that first semester. I would talk to friends in Austin, and they were having the time of their lives. It was just this, amazing story about what college life was like. And I had severe FOMO. And so it didn't take long. And I was like, I think I made a mistake. I'm going to transfer to UT. And so I did do that. And I think, the lesson for me in that was, number one, thinking through big decisions, like really thinking about what it is that you're trying to solve for, or what you're trying to do, or I think for me, I was a little bit distracted by something that seemed shiny and different and new, but I hadn't really pressure tested where I was going to be happy. So my only regret in that situation, and Vanderbilt was a beautiful campus. I met a lot of wonderful people there. My only regret, though, is that I wish I would have just gone to UT from the beginning, because I obviously had to give up the scholarship. That scholarship was not waiting for me when I decided to go back to UT. So I gave up the scholarship, but all of it worked out. I graduated. I had a great undergrad experience there. As you mentioned, I got a degree in finance at the Macomb School of Business. And went on from there. So
It's always good, I think, though, that you tried it. Maybe it didn't work out because not everything works out, but you walk away with those lessons. And any other, I think, big decision that came your way, whether it was like a different role or moving cities or whatever it is, you've already got that big kind of not failure, but like big lesson learned early on in your career. So I think at the end of the day, it's good and you tried it. And you would
Right.
never know because I bet you if you would have went to UT, you would have been like, my life in Vanderbilt would have been amazing. So it's like you would just live with those things. So it's good that you kind of like got it out of the way. But
No, that's a great point.
yeah, but to mention, you studied finance and it seemed that you kind of like you knew what you wanted to do from a young age, and finance was one of the things that you wanted to do, as well as just travel. And it seemed you lived in Asia for a little bit over a period, and just then when you graduated, you went to work at Enron, and we all know kind of that story and how that ended. And you were a financial analyst. And so tell us a little bit about what was your love for finance and why finance specifically? And then what did working in Enron right before the collapse teach you about stability in a company, culture, leadership, and during those hard times when everything's like people are walking out with boxes, like how do you learn about leadership in that moment?
Yeah, I think, the choice to go into finance was one where I had always enjoyed math. I excelled at math. I enjoyed math. I liked thinking logically about things. I'd always been an observer of the market from like a younger age. I was playing in the market, and so it was kind of a natural step for me. I think with a degree in finance too, there's just tremendous optionality. There's an obvious path when you're coming right out of undergrad to go into banking or go to investment banks or go into a financial analyst program. And at the time when I was in school, there were several large energy companies that had rotational programs for finance majors. And that really appealed to me because I like the idea of being able to maybe go into a company but do some different things and then rotate after a while. So that was really attractive. And Enron, I mean, at the time, I remember when they came to campus for kind of the informational sessions, it was the standing room only crowd. And they were talking about weather derivatives. That was one of the teams that they'd brought. One of the guys had come in from that team and was talking about weather derivatives, and I'd never heard of that concept before. I knew what a derivative was, but I hadn't heard of a weather derivative. And I just thought everything about that company and the way they were presenting themselves and selling kind of how they, I mean, we all know this. We know the story of Enron. But I thought that is awesome, and that's where I want to be. I was so excited when I got that offer. Moved back to Houston. I started in July of 2001. The first Wall Street Journal article that something was amiss came out in October. So, and that was kind of when everything just started really, really kind of, the bottom kind of fell out. And the bankruptcy was in December. So I was there for kind of the end, and in some ways that was good news because I wasn't even there long enough to open a retirement account. And if you recall, that was one of the kind of the worst parts of that story is how so many employees were negatively impacted by essentially getting locked out of their accounts and not being able to sell as the stock was just spiraling. But one of the lessons I learned, it kind of came to a fine point for me actually later in my career. You mentioned I worked for the U.S. Department of Energy, and I was there for several years as an advisor. I did oil and gas and coal policy. And when I was leaving the department, actually to take the job at Apache and move home, I had an opportunity to meet very briefly with the Secretary of Energy. And that was kind of a custom that they did when you left. You got to take a photo and have a brief conversation with him. And at the time, the Secretary of Energy was a man named Sam Bodman, Secretary Bodman. And he had been a CEO of a large publicly traded company. And when we were kind of debriefing on my time at DOE and what I'd learned, he said, if I remember, didn't you work at Enron? And I said, yes, sir, I worked at Enron. It wasn't for very long, but he said, I'm going to tell you, though, I think that was probably a really formidable experience for you because one of the things that, and he'd, again, been a CEO, so he said, one of the things that I think you realize is when you are employing thousands of people, when you are driving value for shareholders, when you're having a tremendous economic impact on the communities where you work and where you have employees, you have a tremendous responsibility. And he said what happened with Enron affected so many people. It affected people's retirements. It affected the nonprofit community in Houston. I mean, I remember hearing stories about people who worked in nonprofit fundraising, and Enron had been such a pillar of the nonprofit community as a donor, but also just very involved in so many causes across the city. So there was an impact there when that suddenly disappeared. So just really thinking about the weight of the decisions that companies have and leadership of companies have on people and on communities. And obviously there's an opportunity to have a tremendous positive impact, but there's also, when not properly managed, the opportunity to have a very negative impact.
What a lesson that you learned there. I mean, that's something that's hopefully not repeatable in anybody's history when you hear about what happened to Enron, but I think it definitely is something where there's many books, many articles, many things came out of what happened with Enron to better, the finance community and also just the way that we work. And to your point, just the impact that you have on everybody's life. To talk about life after Enron, you ended up working on the trade floor. So I want to kind of know a little bit about how you got to the trade floor, your expectations when you got there, because you were very interested in the natural gas market. You saw all these significant events happening on the trade floor because they're very visible in that aspect because it impacts everything that happens on that floor. And I remember you saying something about like TVs being there and like you being able to see and witness everything that's going on and how that impacts, how the trades are going that day. And then you were very successful in that role, but you wanted to go to the DOE, as you mentioned before. And I recall a time that you went to your boss to like tell him like this is what you're going to do, and then he questioned like, why are you going to do this? You have such a career here, but you decided to take the risk. So I'd love for you to talk to us about how you overcame like any of those fears that might have came with taking the risk because you just left and went and did it, and then also what interests you so much in the energy space.
So when I left Enron, I went to another energy trading company, RWE, which is a German utility, and I worked on the gas and power trade floor. And one of the things that happened while I was there, so I was there in it was the 2002, 2003, 2004 timeframe. But the Shock and Awe campaign, which was a U.S. military campaign, this was all post 9/11. And it occurred overnight in the Middle East, and it was televised. So the actual dropping of bombs was televised. And I mentioned we had televisions everywhere. We had a very large screen as well, kind of in the center of the trade floor. And so we all paused when that was happening, and we watched this campaign live on television. And I just remembered thinking, wow, like this is a tremendously significant world event. And I knew that I liked being part of energy. Like I knew that the energy industry was critical and paramount to so many things. But at that moment when I saw what was happening, and again, this was very post 9/11 mindset too, I realized that while I really liked energy, I might find more purpose in something directly related to energy policy because again, I was watching something happen on TV that at the end of the day was somewhat tied, maybe not directly or maybe not the first reason we were there, but it was tied to energy. And I just realized that there might be something more fulfilling for me to do in the energy space if I moved to Washington and pursued working in policy. I had worked on political campaigns growing up. I'd always been very interested in politics. Politics and policy are a little bit different, but they were things that I just naturally followed and was naturally interested in. And perhaps the experience going to Vanderbilt and kind of making what was in hindsight maybe not the right decision influenced how I thought about that decision to move to Washington. Because I really wanted to be clear again on what was I trying to do, like what was I trying to solve for by literally, I quit my job in Houston and I moved to DC without a job. And you mentioned when I went to go tell my boss at the time that I was going to do that, he looked at me like, what are you doing? I was in my 20s, and he was like, why would you do? You have a great job. You're on a great path. Like, what are you doing? And this is something I need to do. Like I feel compelled, like I want to be part of a broader solution. And I think I can do that there, getting into policy. And eventually, and he said, you know what, I respect the decision. And in fact, I have a very good friend up there and I'm going to put you in touch with him. And that is actually how I got my first job in DC, was through one of his friends who he connected me to, who helped me, introduce me to somebody who I ended up taking a job with. So it worked out. It was certainly a risk. I mean, I sold my car, moved up there with very little money, and had, you know, took my resume around. I remember, like, just for about a month and a half, I was just knocking on doors and trying to get a job. And eventually I landed on my feet, and that ultimately led to the opportunity at the Department of Energy.
I love just all the risk taking, even from wanting to follow a different path than the rest of your friends and going to Vanderbilt and then quitting your job and looking for DC, and kind of like always finding like your true north in a way of like, I feel called to do something. And even though everybody's telling me not to, I'm just going to follow it. And, you know, after all of this, you got into Apache, and that's kind of how you've been for the last 19 years. And you've had a super successful career there, different roles, and kind of just moving in different aspects. The one that we wanted to kind of discuss a little bit, because I find it super interesting, is when you became investors relations. And that's a tough job. I think it's one that all companies have, but nobody really knows about because they're kind of incognito in a way. Like it's all very, you know, they can't talk, I'm sure, about a lot of the things that they're part of, et cetera. And you get to work really closely with the C-suite, and you actually have to travel to all the board meetings and all the times that they're going to talk to investors, et cetera. And so can you tell us a little bit about what that lifestyle looked like of just traveling and being at other people's calendars, like at their mercy? Because I did have a friend who worked in that, and it's like, no matter what you want to do that year, you have to follow their calendar. And just, you know, how that was like. And then also just, you know, you mentioned like as you're going through that role, there's a lot of examples of people making mistakes in front of, you know, such influential people or audiences. And then just it's a stressful job because you have to be on your A game with all of these C-suites from the company that you work for. So just tell us a little bit about that, maybe your daily routine, what surprised you the most of the job, and how you handled it with your own personal life and whatever that looked like family-wise.
Well, when I was asked to go to investor relations, that also kind of came out of left field. I'd gotten a graduate degree. I'd been working in government affairs as a lobbyist for Apache. And it was shortly after I got my degree. You mentioned the dual degree, which was basically getting a degree in energy policy. So I came back full time, ready to tackle DC. Like I was really ready to go be an advocate for oil and gas. And I, out of the blue, was asked if I would go work in investor relations. And I remembered thinking, and I didn't say this out loud, but I remembered thinking, like, this doesn't make any sense. Apache just helped pay for me to go get a graduate degree. This doesn't seem like the right use of my skills. I did have the finance undergrad degree, but it'd been a long time since I'd really worked in that space. And so I was unsure, but the things that came out of my mouth were more along the lines of, no problem, happy to do it, I'll figure it out. And it was very intimidating initially because, as you mentioned, you are, in some ways, investor relations and government affairs, there's some similarities. You are communicating with and building relationships with an external stakeholder. But in the case of investors, they want specifics. They will spend as much time with you as they need to. They want to go through the details. They want to look the CEO in the eye. They want to meet with C-level executives and hear the story and the strategy from their perspective. So for me, it was a real opportunity, one, to really learn the business and understand, how does this company make money? How do we explain the choices that we're making? How do we tell a compelling story about where we're going and why we would therefore encourage investors to, invest in Apache or stick with Apache? And so I had to learn a lot about the business, our operations all around the globe. I had to really get refamiliarized with the financials. And then, as you mentioned, it's a very high profile role because the others that you're working with are the C-suite. You're traveling with them to conferences, you're sitting in one-on-one meetings with them, with investors, you're helping prepare for the earnings call. It's a pretty high profile, high stress situation. And I have seen people be tremendously successful in IR who, particularly younger folks, when they come in, they do an incredible job. And I've seen people who just can't get it together. And unfortunately, you're not getting it together in front of an important audience. So it can be quite career limiting. For me, what I saw an opportunity to do early on was to become kind of the data guru for the CEO. So when we were in meetings and he got a question that might be something very specific about Midland County, he may not know every single detail in his head, but Castlen did. And so I built kind of this rapport with him where he almost didn't want to go to the meetings unless Castlen was there, because she had her big binder and she knew where every rig was running and she knew what every rig rate was and she could tell you about this lateral. And so it became like I had all the data. And so I learned how to make myself invaluable in that moment. And I think it was tremendously helpful for my career because, again, I had an audience that was influential. And so it opened up opportunities for me because they got to know me, they got to know my work ethic. And so they thought of me for new things when those things came up. To your question about lifestyle, you are traveling a lot. I had at the time just had my first son. And so it took a lot of working with my husband to make sure we could accommodate the travel and whatnot. And but we made it work. We made it work, and it was manageable. It wasn't it was maybe a trip a month kind of thing. Sometimes maybe 2 trips a month, but we made it work.
Castlen, what we haven't even gotten into yet with your story, which I love so much, is, you've excelled substantially, 19 years at Apache. You have done so many incredible things. You built your brand, like you said, a very dependable brand, which is how you were able to move in these different roles, all while having, your 2 children. You just mentioned the one that you had during the investor relation role, but y'all are a dual career family. And then I remember when we spoke, you were like, "Oh, I got a bonus baby as well," which really threw you for a loop. And having just my second child, 5 months old now, I'd love to hear, like, how did you manage? You had 2 older children. I can't remember the age differences, but then you had this baby that just totally, you had independence in the other children, and now you have a dependent child. With both of y'all's, very heavy schedules. Your husband works too. What's the secret? What did you do? And, and you just got, your new role or some adjustment to your role, taking on new things. How were you able to make it work?
Well, you mentioned, so I have 3 sons. My oldest is 11 now, and then I've got an 8-year-old. And we thought we were done after that, and we moved on. We'd graduated to the kind of vacations that you take with your kids, where like they can actually go skiing and they can actually do things. We'd moved into that phase of life, and no more diapers, none of that. And then surprise, we found out we were expecting, and it was a total surprise. And of course, with that came some, a little bit of nervousness, and how are we going to do this? And man, we're going to start all over with a different phase again. But I will tell you, you absolutely figure it out, and it works out. And the people in your life that love you rally around you to help you figure that out. And that's obviously, my husband and myself, but also my family. I'm really fortunate that my parents are here. As I mentioned, I've got sisters here, and I am not shy about asking for help. And I think that's one of the things that you have to kind of embrace early on. You absolutely won't be able to be every place and do everything, but if you have a really dependable network of people that you can depend on, and some of that's family, and some of that's it's nannies, some of that's help, some of that's people that you bring into your life to help you kind of get all of those things done. And so we hired a tremendous nanny who's a part of our family. She is incredibly close with our kids. She's just a lifesaver for me, and that has been a big help to us. But again, friends have been a tremendous help as well. And believe it or not, my older children have been a tremendous help. I think when I was thinking through what is this going to be like when we have this baby, and I have boys, I don't know that they're going to be that nurturing or that interested. And I couldn't have been more wrong. Our sons have been incredibly helpful, and they love hanging out with their little brother. The youngest is his name's Maverick, and they take care of him. They change diapers. They help get him up and get him dressed. So it is a team effort at the Kennedy house. There are a lot of hands helping. So, but we make it work, and I'm incredibly blessed with those three boys. They're a lot of fun.
I love that. And that's such an inspiration for so many people who don't have children yet because they're worried about what that's going to mean for their career or just like their work-life balance. That's something Jamie and I were both worried about before having children. And so I just love hearing these stories where we keep reassuring women that it's going to be okay. You're going to figure it out. And just, I think the message here is don't be afraid to ask for help. And I feel like we always say it, but really you need a village and you need to ask people, because sometimes they can't read your mind of I need help for you to babysit on Friday or something. So I love that you mentioned that. And kind of the last question we had for you, and is one that I think, yes, we ask quite a bit, even in our panels, etc. But it's one that I still think is quite relevant because every time we talk to women, this always shows up. And it's the fact that women, aren't always applying for those jobs that they want because they feel like they're not qualified for it, or when they get a new opportunity at work, because I do feel companies are trying to promote women. They're like, take this challenge, we're going to give it to her, etc. But they always feel this self-doubt of, I don't check all the boxes. I don't think I'm smart enough. I don't think I can handle this because I've never run this. I've never had a big team, etc. And through your journey at Apache, you've had certain jobs, like you mentioned, where you're like, I don't know why me, or I don't know if I could do it, but you just say like, yes, I'll take care of it and I'll figure it out. So can you tell us a little bit, what advice would you give to those listening that have that self-doubt, that keeps showing up every time there's a role coming up where they feel like they can't do it?
Well, I think just simply the statistic that women don't want to raise their hand because they feel like they have to be fully prepared for a job, whereas we know male counterparts don't always wait for that confidence to being able to fully complete a job or fully do a job. Just knowing that off the get-go should give women that extra push to say, okay, put your name in the hat, raise your hand. But the other thing I'll just say about it is, and I'm seeing this more later in my career, is the importance of having not just female, but also male supporters in your organization, because you want, in those conversations that you're not in, you want people to be advocating for the possibility that you could do it. And I find myself now in those conversations often, where we'll be talking about talent, we'll be talking about an opportunity, and somebody's name will come up, and I feel, especially for women that I know well and I know are very capable, I'm always like, she can do it. Let's put her in it. Let's see what she can do. I think once you get in the role, it's really important to, again, ask for help. Don't feel like you have to get in there and show everybody how amazing you are immediately. Like, learn the role, ask a lot of questions, ask for help, ask for feedback. Again, I'm just a big believer that if you try to navigate, whether it's life or home, completely by yourself, that's hard to do. And the sooner you bring people in to help you, I think the easier things get.
Castlen, I couldn't align better with that. And I'm just thinking about some roles in my own personal career where I'm like, you're so right. You take on the role and you really need to start asking people like, yeah, like, who do I talk to for this? Who do I talk to for that? And if you just stay closed in and be like, well, they gave me this role, I'm supposed to know everything, you start to feel very isolated and very alone. So thank you for sharing that and knowing that like we all go through that no matter what the role is. And I'm just so glad we finally got to record your episode today. When we first met, I just absolutely loved your story. I loved you and just your personality too, and how you gone through so much. And I had no idea about the bonus baby either. And so that was really exciting to hear about. And just your time at Apache, 19 years, that's really incredible. And not to mention how you even just held yourself and your brand during that time. I think a lot of our listeners can learn from that. Thank you, Castlen, so much for spending time with us today and sharing your journey on Flipping the Barrel.
Thank y'all.
And if you like this podcast, please like, subscribe. You can find us everywhere, flippingthebarrel.com, Flipping the Barrel on LinkedIn, Flipping the Barrel on Instagram. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Thank you.